Republicans. Yeah, and he just absolutely has no tolerance for any of the Bushes. I mean, I think he backed Reagan and everything. He's going through a long litany of some of the tie-ins of business ties the Bush family had from the 30s with real right-wing repressive governments, and the family's kind of relationship since the 80s with Bin Laden family of Saudi Arabia. Kind of not Osama, but the Bin Laden family. He said he's never seen such a connection in history or politics. Well, someone who's so connected to the intelligence agency.
Recording.
His father had connections with the old OSS, the CIA. Foreseen himself as a CIA then became president. But now seeing such a tie-in with the Clinton family with the intelligence community. Right. After all that, right? No. Well, I don't think they liked the information they were getting. I've been trying to read through it. Yeah, they were really cherry picking bits and pieces of information. They wanted to go. They were going to go in there anyway. So when they didn't see some reports from the CIA that they agreed with, the Baby and Cheney and Rumsfeld, they just picked out a few little tidbits that they liked. That was their justification. The CIA really was discrediting a lot of this stuff. The CIA never said that there was a connection. The CIA never said that it was uranium from nitrogen. They never said that. It was things I've been reading. Someone on that Iraqi governing council, Shabali or something, a real powerful person who was in exile at the time, was giving the United States government all this erroneous information because he wanted the United States to go over there so he could come back in. Shabali, his name is Chabeali. He's on the governing council. So they were listening to what they wanted to listen to.
Oh, you guys
They were rejecting any other counter. Yeah. I hope it will. I mean, two things will turn for him. I would not be surprised.
I think
Fine. Right before the Democratic.
Really want to.
I mean, some of the theories going around now is they know exactly where he's going to hold it off until. Can you imagine? Do it right before the Democratic National. Work out that entire week of publicity for the Democratic. Perfect. For some strange reason, if the Congress does track to be created, I don't know how, but if they start created around September, October. I don't know. Those two things, though, could win it. But I don't want to wish against those things either. It's terrible.
good ideas for ours. Yeah.
Probably some lean nasties. Election campaign for the next 7 days. More than any other.
On the board outside, I guess.
Check.
Thanks. Okay.
They do? I do, yeah. Okay.
So this is your Hey, Jen, can you ask those guys to kill the lights in the second this drawing? There was an usher that wouldn't let Wayne up the steps. Even though he had a headset on. So I don't know who the usher was.
Yeah.
So next time we do the cattle call of the ushers, you just tell them, look, if the guy that's got a headset on, it looks like he's an air traffic controller or walking
Yeah.
by you.
That's
Don't
really,
refuse
yeah.
an entry.
It's really weird that they see him all the time. Yeah, I'll let you, yeah.
Up there and say a few words. Tell a few jokes. Like,
Oh, yeah, I watched a little bit last night. Even though I was recording, I was like,
All right, just turn on. And register. Hello. Oh, my name is Paul Davis. I'm a freshman here at Harvard College, and I'd like to welcome you all to the forum. This afternoon, we will be discussing the political and cultural divide that separates us as Americans. We are delighted to have Stan Greenberg, one of the country's finest pollsters and opinion makers, as our guest today. Mr. Greenberg has just come out with a new book, The Two Americas, that addresses this topic in great detail. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce David Gergen, who will be guiding the discussion with Mr. Greenberg and moderating questions during the question and answer period. Professor Gergen is no stranger to these issues, having served under 4 presidents, both Democrats and Republicans. He is currently director of the Center for Public Leadership here at the Kennedy School. Without further ado, David Gergen.
thank you very much.
Well, I think Stan and I would both agree that the most important person here is actually not on the stage. And let me introduce and ask if I might, the woman who is Stan Greenberg's congresswoman and his wife, Rosa DeLauro. Please stand. And I might point out that Stan has dedicated his book to Rosa, and perhaps it will be now the blueprint for a new Democratic majority. We'll see. We'll see. Aha! She says it is. It is. Okay. Well, listen, we're honored here today by Stan Greenberg's presence. I must tell you, it must have been 2 years ago when I first said, "Gee, I'd love to have you come to the Kennedy School and talk about politics." You're exactly the kind of person who can help to open doors and open people's minds to sort of the deeper underlying forces in our politics. And he's one of the only people I know who has not only understood and guided American politics, but has spent a great deal of his time engaged with Democratic campaigns in other nations. Listen to this list of people for whom he has served as the polling advisor and political guru in years past. Not only President Bill Clinton, but Nelson Mandela, Tony Blair, Barack, Schroeder, and the President of Bolivia. For starters. There are probably more. That's a warm-up, right?
Office. I got to keep him in office. That's the hard part.
And that's only one man. He's kept keeping him in office is the hard part. There's no doubt about that. This is not someone who comes to politics and takes politics lightly. He, after graduating from college in Miami, came here to Harvard to earn a PhD. He went on to teach at Yale for 10 years and has been a major force in American politics for some time. I can just tell you from my personal experience that Stan was very much part of the war room, as you'll remember in the Clinton campaign of '92, the victorious campaign memorialized by the film. But that when the Clinton presidency was underway, Stan was the person who wrote the political memos that framed the dialogue inside the White House and produced the political strategy by which the president governed. It was the foundation point for the conversations that then went on and really shaped his governing. And he remains very close to the Clinton forces today, has been very closely allied with the New Democrats as well as the, do you call yourself a progressive, New Opportunity Democrat today? What do you call yourself?
I call myself a progressive.
A progressive.
We're all New Democrats.
He's also done a lot of work with corporations as an advisor. And today, I did not know this, he is working as a chief political consultant for I said, are you doing anything with John Kerry? And he said, actually, by law, I can't. Because he's serving as a chief political consultant to all the outside groups like MoveOn.org and the other groups that are now buying advertising and are becoming important forces in this campaign. And so when I asked him about it, he said, he's just come off a 3-hour phone call this afternoon. So he comes fresh from the political wars. We're going to talk here for a little while about his new book, The Two Americas. I would urge you to then come to the microphone and join with questioning, but I would also urge you to go on from here to the Coop, where he's going to be signing books shortly after we finish up here between 5:15 and 5:30. So, new book, dedicated, as I say, to Rosa DeLauro. The Two Americas, Our Current Political Deadlock and How to Break It. James Carville, this is hands down the most important book on American politics in my memory. How far back does his memory go? Maybe since 1960, The Making of the President. And it also has an endorsement not only from George Stephanopoulos, but by Bill Kristol and Mary Madeline, Bob Dahl, and Theda Skopkel here at the Harvard faculty. What an interesting array of people who've read and endorsed this book. Please follow him to the Coop. Stan, welcome. Thank you for coming. We're honored to have you here. What's the thesis of your book?
Well, the thesis, the starting point of the book is the 2000 election, but it doesn't dwell on the 2000 election. The starting point is the divide right down the middle of the country, top to bottom, no matter what you look at, whether it's election of president, Congress, state legislatures, evenly divided. But the argument is that it's not just a divide, it's not just a parity, that our politics has moved into the formation of two blocks that are not just coalitions of groups, but two blocks that have become defined culturally by the battles that have taken place and the issues they've taken on, by the political entrepreneurship on both sides, conservative and liberal side, the issues that they've advanced, have created a cultural politics that has brought increasing unity within each block and increasing polarization in the country. In fact, as you were doing the introduction, I'm trying to think how David Gergen could fit in this particular world. David Gergen, who's served in both White Houses, right now it is so unimaginable in this world that a David Gergen could somehow move back and forth across these blocks. Each of these blocks view this politics is about their way of life. It's not about issues. The politics is about way of life. It's about when you looked on the conservative side, you're dealing with a commitment to tradition and a sense of principles that are long-standing, right and wrong, not contingent. A focus on the individual, but how you free the individual, faith in markets. You move to the Democratic side of this block. You're dealing with a focus on individuals, but how you empower the individual, give the individual the resources to succeed. To focus on diversity and learning, and not absolutes. And contingent understanding and flexibility and tolerance. But those are their postmodernist worldview and a conservative worldview that define our politics. Now, the reason I could you forgive me for going on?
Please.
The reason I tried to figure this out was. I could spend my time trying to win elections, and I'm sure, and the elections matter. More and more they matter, and that's what I do by day. But what I became convinced of was that our politics drives a lot of people out of the process. And more importantly, it drives a lot of issues out of our politics. Or at least it's not capable of taking on a whole range of issues because they don't fit within the polarized cultural politics that dominates. If you look at for those who are in political science or at academia and try to look at regression models or correlations to vote, if you look at ideology now is entirely defined by cultural issues. So your position on abortion. Or your position on guns is very highly correlated whether you're liberal or conservative. What views you have on class, what your views of corporations, your views of trade agreements are uncorrelated. That is, their economic issues have almost no correlation with liberal conservatives, and almost entirely as we've gone through these increasingly intense politics. And what's happened is within each block. It starts in '84, accelerates through '92 and through the '90s, really, but then really profiled in the 2000 presidential election, is that on the Republican side there is a continuing effort to try to get more unity, more mobilization from the white evangelicals who are very much part of it. There's the business-oriented voters, and with tax cuts, trying to get more and more unity and support for Republicans there. The people I call the FU boys. The kind of the younger blue-collar men, white blue-collar men, don't want government messing with their gun, don't want people messing with America. Bush speaks to them, but their vote has become more and more Republican. So you get those blocks which are very much the center of the politics on the conservative side. And then on the Democratic side, you get you have the African American and Hispanic voters, and the turnout of those groups has gone up through the 90s, and they're symbolic of issues that have been important in building up their turnout. People I call the secular warriors, people who don't own a gun and don't go to church, who are 15% of the electorate, but vote increasingly Democratic, heavily Democratic, because as this politics is increasingly defined in cultural terms. But there are big issues before the country. There's the growing inequality over the last 2.5 decades. this battle, this cultural battle, has almost no chance to address those questions. We have all kinds of issues related to globalization we can't begin to address. All kinds of issues related to the environment and global sustainability can't be addressed within this healthcare. This system deals with a little bit of prescription drugs for seniors or some healthcare for kids, but can't deal with the healthcare crisis within this kind of politics. And I wrote the book because I think our politics can't deal with the issues that face the country. I think the way change happens in this country, and it's happened over time, is when parties step up to take on big tasks for the country. And that's where political change comes. And my goal in writing this was not to wallow in how awful this impasse is and this intense partisanship, but was to write a book that said, how do we change it? And I tried to write it in a way that that each party would find, on each side of this divide, would find something to grab onto on how to change it. Obviously, I have a bias in this. It has a happy ending. You should know. But it's about how to make change. It's how to win, but it's also how to bring about much bigger change than that.
Now, are you saying that this election season and the last election was, in 1992, it was the economy stupid, right? We all remember that from that campaign. And I thought to a considerable degree, President Clinton won on the economic issues, but you're saying it's cultural differences that drive the parties. Did cultural differences win the elections, or did economic issues win the elections?
Well, obviously, the most important issue, the most important dynamic on any election is going to be the economic issues. But what's interesting, because the cultural politics goes up against it, and that's why I tried to talk about the accelerated cultural politics in the last three elections of '92, '96, and 2000. Because what happens is that you get people, through the '90s, who's Clinton offered a lot of hope. I write in here, I think mostly positive about the Clinton presidency, but I also talk about the shortcomings, both shortcomings in governance, but shortcomings in how the coalition failed to bring along the broader middle, which I think got left out of in the end, out of the Clinton coalition as part of why the Democrats fall short. Because given the nature of the worldview on the Democratic side, the Democratic coalition is racially diverse. It's inclusive, and it brings in many of the immigrant voters. It's bringing in many of the better educated voters, which is cut against the traditional class divide. And so you have very much a kind of cosmopolitan, globally oriented, better educated, along with very racially diverse population, which is almost half the country. It's close to a winning majority, but what's left out, is the middle. And so what happened during the Clinton period was that those voters, many of them voted for in '92, and many of them on economic grounds, found that incomes didn't rise. Blue collar voters were didn't see income gains until '96, '97. Blue collar voters were offended on values. And were held back on taxes and on slow income gains. They were upset about gays in the military. And so what you've had is that many of these kind of blue-collar voters kind of go out of the Democratic coalition, even though on economic grounds they ought to be there. The cultural politics, the kind of cultural issues on the Democratic side move them out, plus a failure to make rising incomes for middle America central to the Democratic agenda. If your majority is built on cultural politics, it's possible, to have a majority without addressing those economic issues.
Okay. Many of us, when we think about a political spectrum, think about, well, there's one block of voters over here, the Democratic voters here on the left, and there's one block of voters over here on the right, the Republican voters, and then there's this middle. And in some ways, there's been a shrinking middle here in recent years. But then that leaves out a lot of people. As you say, the 50% of the people or so are left out of the system. Are they in the middle? Is this a huge middle that gets shrunk down for the purpose of politics? What are you saying? I'm not quite. Yeah. How do you visualize? What mental picture do you have in your head when you think about American politics?
Well, first of all, I've never been committed to the middle as an ideological middle.
Yeah.
And by the way, Karl Rove is not either. Karl Rove is very clear that the people who are not in these two partisan blocs are very diverse in their thinking, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So, but I want to underscore the current dynamics. When these blocs have worked to get more and more unity and play off of each other in terms of as the Republicans became more unified and more intense, it produced a counter reaction on the Democratic side. And what's happened is that the people in the middle have been forced to choose between these two blocs that are both mostly playing base politics. And Rove is very clear about it. Rove has a strategy of, if I can get as much turnout and as much unity in these groups, that's my starting point. Then I will work to try to pick off some voters beyond that. I begin with my ideological politics, and also not just ideological. It's paying off business-oriented, upper-income voters with tax cuts. It's making sure those rural voters have not just our good values, but have farm subsidy programs as well. And for the white evangelicals, there'll always be some new issue, whether it's gay marriage or 10 Commandments in the courtroom. So there's a strategy to make sure you get more and more unity. It costs money. Okay.
And so from Rove's point of view, what you do, and this happened under Democrats as well, but let's just take it from the current. So you have your coalition. It's made up of these diverse forces, and you try to make sure each piece of the base gets something.
Right.
While you're president, it keeps them loyal, keeps them energized, keeps them with you.
Yeah. And not just holds them. Because take the white evangelicals, they're moving to be voting for Republicans now almost as strongly as African Americans vote for Democrats. So they've moved this up. I don't have the exact number in my head, but it's something like from 60 to 75, from 55 to 75% over the decade of voting Republican amongst white evangelicals. So there's a lot of votes to be gotten in both turnout and more unity. Now, however,
what you're saying though is the policies have been to a significant degree shaped, as with farm subsidies, to keep the rural vote, or with gay marriage to energize the evangelical vote.
Right. Now, there's also now I'm talking tactics. They also have some very big tactics to go beyond that, which is to reach out to some groups with initiatives that do not jeopardize the ideological support that you've built up in your base.
To reach beyond your base.
Right, and beyond the base is not about getting the ideological middle. It is the three groups that they have focused on for various reasons. First is suburban women, college-educated women with education. That's why Bush, and it was very clear when he ran for governor, that's why they focused on education there. He ran on it the moment he had the primary settled in 2000 on education. That was the first initiative once in the White House. Now, it hasn't worked. But they are, because the suburban women have not moved back, but they're very conscious that these college-educated women used to be very Republican. They're now kind of evenly divided, and they're trying, education is very much part of trying to keep them from moving over to the Democratic side. The second piece is Hispanics. Hispanics, growing proportion of the population, 8%, likely to be 8% of the electorate, much more in places like Nevada and Arizona, New Mexico and Florida, and Colorado, and very key, and New Jersey, very key to those states. So that's what the immigration reform is about. And the last piece is prescription drugs for seniors. Seniors used to be 60% from every election from 1952 to the late 80s. Seniors were about 60% Republican. Now, what happened under Reagan is seniors began to doubt that Republicans were committed to Social Security. Nixon and Eisenhower increased Social Security as much as Democrats. But they weren't, starting with Reagan, not so sure. Collapse in the 90s. Bill Clinton wins seniors, biggest group for age group for Clinton. Republicans have worked to get that back. That's what prescription drugs are about.
Okay, so your interpretation of what Carl's up to is keep your base through these various policies, make sure each group within the base has a policy or two that they can either be grateful for or rally around, and then reach out to the groups beyond the base. 3 groups beyond the base with these individualized policies. And your suggestion is that this has all been well thought out, it's framed, they've thought all along we need to get these groups, and they've seen opportunities to get them with various kind of initiatives.
Now, we'll say that Matthew Dowd, who's Bush's chief strategist, said on TV that he agreed with the argument of the book. So it's not just, and I have a nice note from Rove on this as well. But let me make a point about it, and then just go to a higher level for them. The problem with the strategy is that it is not clear that is in fact, it does have its contradictions. There are, I mean, people in the base don't like this immigration reform, and the money isn't adding up. The deficit, I mean, all of these strategies cost money. Prescription drugs, farm subsidies, all these things cost money, tax cuts. And so that it is not quite adding up, and it's limiting their ability to play out the strategy. But they are, I mean, I also play out for them, and I think they're self-conscious about this, and this is why Rove talks about President McKinley frequently, is that there is a Reagan vision. I mean, because it can't just be it just can't be a group of tactics. That is, there's a Reagan vision that says this is about something more than these particular tactics, and it is a worldview on how America becomes better and stronger. It was not a very plausible view in my mind before 9/11, but with 9/11 and the kinds of threats that they are able to focus on in the world, there is a overall Reagan perspective, which I don't have time to elaborate, but that gives this a unity that goes beyond simply a bunch of tactics.
So the tactics fit within a larger ideological framework.
They can.
Of a
When
small,
they are-
so when they go to tax cuts, as you say, for the business elite, it's still true that fits within the overall larger framework of believing that smaller government, more incentives, actually produces a better country.
Yes.
I mean, it's not inconsistent with this larger, it's in fact quite consistent.
It is. They've been, but they were very uneven in articulating it until 9/11.
Right, but I wanted to, now would you be candid enough to talk about some of the tactics that the Clinton folks used to energize their base? I mean, for example, the earned income tax credit.
No, ours was all high-minded. It was what's in the best. I don't remember any tactics.
Right, right. Or going into Haiti.
No, I mean, look. If you look, the book is, I think, quite even-handed on this. The dynamic, you know, there's something different when you have. It's not just you have two blocks. They are close. They're identical in size, culturally defined, and the politicians each day wake up. And this is very important, I think, to part of what drives this. The politicians wake up each day and say, "I have an equal chance as the other guy of winning the election." Mm-hmm. I mean, these aren't people that are irrational or insane. Each party has an equal chance of winning, which greatly impacts. It's a very different politics when both sides think they can win or lose, and that's what leads, I think, to a quite intense application of these tactics. Now, there's no doubt. Let's say take the issue of Hispanics. What happened on immigration issues in California, and the Democrats highlighting of those issues, very important in '96 to why Clinton got such a massive Hispanic vote, big shift in the Hispanic vote. African Americans, more than any other group, believed that Clinton was their president and believed that the impeachment process was about overturning an election and pushing out of office their president, and the animosity and the belief that the 2000 election was stolen specifically by suppressing the African American vote, animates African American politics and builds turnout. Turnout will be very high. Now, I can go through the groups, whether it's the choice issue and other issues that that are very central. I mean, right now, just to give you a sense of the change in politics, that's part of this. I talked about the FU boys. Okay, they're defined as white men under 50 years of age, white men under 50 without a college degree. Okay, overwhelmingly they're married. Married. Most of them have kids. Okay, they used to be in the 50s a quarter of the population. We followed them with GI benefits and mortgages and whatever. Okay, they are now 6% of the electorate because of the changes in the country, which has made the Democratic coalition possible. This kind of diverse coalition possible because the country has gone from being overwhelmingly married to now being a majority unmarried. Going with a large immigrant, population, under 30% of the population is non-white, whereas only under 10% among seniors. So your young population, very racially and ethnically immigrant diversity, and you got to shift up in college education. So all of those pressures have reduced the size of the blue collar men. On the other hand, 7% of the electorate are women with postgraduate degrees. which is bigger than the group of what people we thought is kind of the heart and soul of the blue-collar family.
7% of the
7%
women
are women with postgraduate degrees,
postgraduate
and they are
degrees?
overwhelmingly Democratic. They are pro-choice. They're very hostile to the kind of conservative cultural politics. Very polarized at the moment, but it's a growing number. But it gives a sense of. But you're right about what's happened during the 90s and on the Democratic side. There's a whole series of groups in which Democrats have stressed issues that have led to more unity in Democratic voting, higher turnout. Union voters, union voters, they have been the unions obviously are a declining proportion of the labor force, but they're not a declining proportion of the electorate, because the unions have worked in each election with greater and greater intensity to get more and more union turnout, right. And using the issues that mobilize them.
Right. Now, let's translate this when it comes into a presidential election. The old notion was that the way you won a presidential election was you ran in the primaries within your base, you appealed to your base. As soon as you got the nomination, you went to the middle, because that's where you got the votes to win the election. Mm-hmm. And that each side had a base that was 35% or so of the electorate, maybe 40, but that there was this great unwashed middle, undecided, unattached, that might go either way, and you won the election by going to the middle and appealing essentially to the centrist tendencies in the country. But now the Republicans led by Karl Rove have been talking increasingly, and you hear about this among some Democrats, no, the new way to win is win by energizing your base. That the middle has shrunk so much and it's splintered so much that the way you win is by getting your base out and by appealing to your base the whole way. And where that leads you is to a much more partisan election, in which is, instead of going to the middle and finding common ground, people are separating out more and are villainizing the other side. And is that the kind of election we now face, that each side tries to energize its base? That's the primary purpose of the election?
Now, I'm not saying I recommend this, that I think this is a wholesome politics.
You think it's a wholesome politics?
No. I'm saying I don't think it's wholesome, but I believe it's real.
You think that's where we are?
I think it's real. That is, just look what's happened this year on the Democratic side. So as part of this process and part reaction to what's happened on the Republican side, you have the Democrats united as I've never seen before, with very high turnout in the early, and while it was still a contest, very high turnout in their primaries, coming out of at the end of the primary, unified behind the candidate, and intensely anti-Bush in their preference, and with a base-oriented messages. They were running against Bush on a whole series of issues, energizing the Democrats. Came out of that process. Now, both sides are mobilized, and you look at the polls right now, they're even. I mean, this process that we've talked about, that we've played out now, as these two blocks back, coming to an even battle, that's where we are now. We have an even. Both sides have played this game, to even. Okay. Now, there will be a battle to their way. I've talked about how the Republicans reach out. Democrats will have their strategies for reaching out, which I'm happy to talk about.
What groups beyond the base are important for
Democrats? Well, first of all, let me tell you what's there. There's two big. I didn't answer you earlier. There's two big forces out there beyond this. I would like. My recommendation is to the Democrats is don't accept this game.
Don't play this game.
Don't play this game.
Don't play this base politics.
Look, they can win. I do. But the way I did the end of this book, the last third of this book is about how to change it, and half of that third is on how the Democrats change it.
The more passionate third.
I did the Republican part as a Karl Rove PowerPoint presentation to Bush. On the Democratic side, I had consultants come together who are current advisors of the main presidential campaigns, who read the book, but I didn't have the last two chapters, who read the book, and who did a series of simulated meetings on how they would run to beat Bush. And so I do the last two chapters as how to win this thing. Now, I have to tell you, with power mattering so much, who wins mattering so much, with the two blocks so evenly matched, and with the polls right now confirming evenly matched coming out, that the tactics are tempting. It's tempting to say, look, Al Gore was not the strongest candidate, very secular, really unable to reach out into a lot of mainstream America. Had lots of trust problems that were inherited from Clinton. If we just have a little reassurance on values, we can do a little bit better. We can accept this with a little reassurance. We can get a little bit beyond. Or alternatively, let's deal with the corporate abuses that have taken place in the Bush era. There's a whole series of groups, whether it's rural areas or many older blue-collar voters who Democrats have lost, who are very upset with what's happened with the corporate excess. Let's talk about those issues to bring over those voters. So just as the Republicans have tactics for going out and grabbing some voters, so do Democrats. So the temptation is to say, accept the game. Let's just do our tactics better than their tactics. Now, my view is that first, you leave a lot of people out of the election. Half the people aren't voting because this game is driving them away. The turnout's higher for people that are part of these blocks, but not for those in the middle. So, for example, I'm going to give you a group that's in the middle. Take unmarried women as a group of voters, white unmarried women. And particularly the non-college white unmarried women. They voted in high numbers in 1992. A lot of hope with Perot, a lot of hope with Clinton, high turnout. And then, Clinton health care plan crashed. That was something that was very important to them. Turnout has dropped steadily through this period. So you have this intense cultural battle between these blocks. These women out there who are economically marginal, not married, so don't have the security of that comes with two earners in the household. They feel increasingly that politics is irrelevant to them, won't address the issues that matter to their lives. Their turnout goes down. So you have a lot of people that are outside of this because the issues have been constricted. And then you have groups of voters that just can't figure out how to fit within these blocks. And I'll give you some examples, but without dealing with all young voters. What do young voters make of all this? And particularly since what's going to happen is there'll be a battle over seniors. It was true in the 2000 election. It was true in the 2002 election. It'll be true in the 2004 election. There'll be a big battle over prescription drugs, whose is better, whether this one's bad, Medicare reform, Social Security, privatization, blah, 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 blah. But what will young people, what would the election be about for young people? My guess is they get, their turnout has gone down. They were under 30 was 17% of the electorate in 1992. They're likely to be about 9% of the electorate.
Really?
Right. Steady drop in turnout as politics is not very relevant to them. There's more civic involvement, I think, by many indicators, but the politics just doesn't draw them in. Now, that could change this year. Some evidence in the primaries that it started to, but young voters don't fit. And there's a lot of blue collar and rural voters who, on values terms, like the Republicans, but don't like the corporate abuse and are conflicted. And so there'll be battles over them, but there won't be a real battle unless you raise issues that are much bigger than the ones that are advanced within this tactical battle, between these two blocks.
Such as raise real issues that go beyond the tactical.
Yeah, I mean
How do you break out of the deadlock?
Okay.
Let's go to that piece.
Okay, well, let me step back to the just historically.
Okay.
The historical argument of the book is that if you look at most of our history from 1800 to 1950, that most of those periods were periods in which one party was dominant, and dominant in the sense of won most of the elections or all the elections, and they were dominant in ideas. They weren't just electorally dominant. They established the common sense of the period. They established the agenda. They took on the national projects for the country, whether it was the Jeffersonian Democrats who won 6 elections in a row and took on a whole range of tasks from enshrining human farming to the expansion of the country, or whether it was the Republicans and Lincoln and dealing with preserving the Union and dealing with the end of slavery, or whether it's the New Deal Democrats who won 5 elections in a row and dealt with the Depression and bringing the country out of poverty and fighting fascism. But almost all of those parties had a central purpose for the country, and that's why they were in power. They lost power when their central defining purpose was out of sync with the new issues that were arising that their parties and the party conflict could not address. So the Whigs, could not address. In fact, they had defined it off the table. Both the Democrats and the Whigs had made regional deals that said they couldn't deal with slavery, and it came up against problems that the country needed to have addressed. The parties couldn't address it. You didn't get a change because they won some group in the middle. It wasn't because the soccer moms moved over that you got a switch from one party to the other. It was over very big issues. Questions of national purpose.
Mm-hmm. Usually when the other side failed to address those issues.
Right. For whatever reason, why they couldn't, they were so committed to what they were, to the project that brought them to office that they couldn't make the transition to deal with the rising problems, and new political groupings emerged to take them on. I'm basically urging the Democrats to escape this by not winning it group by group, but by recognizing that there are big problems that this partisan, intense battle can't take on, including inequality, including healthcare, including globalization,
let's slow down
et cetera.
just a second.
Yeah.
Yeah, you just ran through that list very quickly.
Gotta read the book.
Yeah, let's take one or two issues that you think are a way for the Democrats, or the Republicans indeed, to transcend today's politics by taking it on, such as inequality. Mm-hmm. You mentioned inequality.
Right.
What does that mean?
Well,
what would you do to take on, quote,
well, I would begin by talking about it. That is, the country's silent on this question. I mean, you've had an extraordinary increase in inequality through the Reagan period, and that is very much structurally part, of our economic life. It was concealed somewhat in the Clinton period because of the very rapid growth in the late 90s. But if you look at the whole decade, you had almost as big an increase in inequality in the Clinton period. It is very hard to believe. I'm sure, in fact, why we're seeing macro growth right now, but without job growth and without much, thank you, Mr. President, for the economic gains, is because I'm sure that the gains are very uneven right now, and they are purposely uneven. That is, it is the policy in terms of tax policy and others to bring a macro prosperity by making it possible for those who invest to invest. But so one can easily imagine, given the change in the inequality in the tax system, that the current period of growth, whatever happens in the election, we're very likely into another decade of inequality. So if you look, for example, at I was just looking at some data. I was trying to look at economic data for this election, but I just looked at it historically. If you take the bottom 60% of the country, so the great majority of the people of the country, the bottom 60%, and look at the mean income for that group in 1979, they were making $23,000 a year. The average income for the bottom 60%, the majority of the country. Okay. Today, it's $26,000. Okay, $3,000 in 25 years. Okay, I won't give you the upper numbers, but they were very robust. But a majority of the country has had almost no increase in living standards in 2.5 decades. Okay, that seems to me a subject worthy of discussion. Mm-hmm. And once that subject is worthy of discussion, then your tax system is worthy of discussion, and other things that bear on income are worthy of discussion. And so, for me, the starting point is change the topic. I mean, we have to have a different agenda, and by changing, and what I would argue is that the groups that are in these blocks and are locked into these blocks in this cultural battle that both parties are invested in, both parties have a vested interest, in maintaining the cultural politics that excites and energizes their blocks. A discussion about inequality would, I promise you, go across. It's like drawing the line in a different way.
It's not that I disagree with you, but it seems to me the Democratic Party walked away from those issues. Mm-hmm. I was just with a major Hispanic organizer recently, who's been out fighting for people in the lower groups for a long time, and he said the problem we find today among Hispanics is the Republicans increasingly speak for people who make $500,000 a year, and the Democrats increasingly speak for people who make $100,000 a year, and there's nobody speaking for people who make $40,000 a year. I mean, but isn't that something the Democratic Party has gone silent on? I mean, isn't that the problem?
Well, I mean, what happened? Yes, yeah. No, look, look, my life, I was happily an academic, and when I got drawn out of academia to do a project in Michigan for an earlier book. Ultimately it came a book called Middle Class Dreams, but it was a project that was the Michigan Democratic Party and the UAW to go to suburban Detroit and figure out why these strong Democrats, UAW, progressive, UAW members living in Macomb County, a suburban area, who had been the strongest suburban group for John Kennedy, voted overwhelming 74% for Ronald Reagan. Mm-hmm. Okay, how do we get them back? Okay, so you have to read the other book. It was going out to figure out how the Democratic Party reclaimed those voters is what drew me out of academia to do what I do in life now. Mm-hmm. In the end, it's what brought me to Clinton, and what brought Clinton to me was to try to bring those voters back. But the argument was an economic argument and a values argument. Mm-hmm. The Democrats thought they could deal with it economically. I argued they can't. This is about their way of life. It's not. You can't cater to the racism that's there, but you also have to understand the pressures of their lives and the values that are important to them, and issues of personal responsibility and such have to be part of a democratic narrative. That was part of the argument I made there. What happened in the 90s is that first of all, because of demographic changes, it is possible for Democrats to win elections and not have the middle in their coalition. And they're not, for the most part, in their coalition now, except for union households. Working class voters are not in the Democratic coalition. White working class voters are not in. If you take the racial diversity combined with the kind of better educated and cosmopolitan regions, people like Massachusetts, New England, and the coast, you are near to a majority of the country, because the trends of that have made it possible to have a near majority with that without having to get the middle. And in Clinton's presidency, can't tell you how powerful a symbol gays in the military was to those working class voters that you don't get our life if your first issue in your presidency is gays in the military. Okay, you don't get it. You said you were running on the economy. First issue is gays in the military. What part of the world? Where do you come from? But that was a starting point. But it had to do with taxes. It had to do with what happened with Monica Lewinsky, impeachment, all of that. So both economically and values-wise, those middle voters driven out. Okay. Okay. Now, I'm not for a tactic of let's go back and pick those voters out. I'm for a politics that says let's deal with issues that encompass their lives. It's not just them, because if you're going to talk about inequality, then you don't have to choose between African Americans and Hispanics and white working class voters. If you address that question of why you go from $23,000 to $26,000 in 25 years, they're all part of that discussion. So I'm for a bigger discussion.
Okay, if you're for a bigger discussion, let's go to the floor. The questions, the microphones are here, and someone's already lined up. If you would identify yourself and be fairly brief, please, and end with a question mark. Yes, sir.
I'm John Owen. I'm a mid-career here at the Kennedy School. And my question for you is why, even though the conventional wisdom when Nader announced a few weeks ago was that the same left-leaning folks who were supporting him in 2000 sort of get the bigger picture now and wouldn't be supporting him. So why is he now polling just as well as he was in 2000 in key swing states? And who is that demographic that's supporting him?
Yeah, I'm sorry. You're asking about
why Nader is polling so well right now. I'm sorry.
Nader. I didn't hear the Nader. Do you want me to do these one by one, or do you want to take a number of questions?
No, go ahead.
Well, I find Nader disconcerting, to be sure. Very painful. Painful, and obviously in 2000, he's not the sole reason why George Bush is president, but he's one of three reasons he's president.
The other two?
Clinton's late-term failings and Al Gore's supercilious debate performance.
Okay, we're coming back to Nader.
Okay, Nader. Nader was more understandable. His block was more understandable. You're right. It was more understandable in 2000, given that the Democrats had been clearly had disappointed some groups of voters. His bloc was defined. It was a whole variety of disaffected groups that thought Clinton had not been left enough. I'm simplifying, but not been left enough. We got his bloc down in the 2000 election on environment and on choice, but the 2.5% that were left were very much anti-trade, anti-globalization, anti-corporate, anti-trade forces. That 2.5% bloc, and viewed both parties as neither party willing to address those issues. And there's some legitimacy to the fact that neither of the established parties are addressing those issues. If you look at the Nader bloc now, and I've monitored it over time, those issues are quite strong. I don't know what Nader will run on, but those are still real issues on whether these parties are addressing the tensions that come in the globalization process.
How can Democrats win with Nader in a race? Is there any possibility MoveOn.org or others will take out ads against Nader?
That would be wrong.
But you'd be tempted.
I don't know what'll happen. Right now he's polling about 5%. I assume that he would drop even more than in the last election, but he has as much room to do as much damage or more this time than last, because last time 2.5. His vote was 2.5-1 for Gore versus Bush. This time they're 9-1 Kerry versus Bush. That is, it's over almost every Nader vote this time is out of Kerry, and so even if he ends up with 1.5%, is much impact, and it's likely to be more in some states. Oregon is a state that normally had a strong Nader vote, in Wisconsin, and so it changes some of the dynamics. So the question is why? Why hasn't I would have expected. I'll be frank. A lot of things that surprised me this year, despite writing the book. One of them that has surprised me is that the anti-Bush passions that are so strong, I thought would drive down the Nader vote, and it might still. But I thought it would drive. I thought the Nader vote off the bat would be in the 3% range, not the 5% range.
Other surprises? Others?
I'm surprised at the, since I thought Dean was going to be the nominee, and was, to be frank, ready to spend my fall in Europe. There's probably a lot of Dean supporters here. I thought Dean would lose the election, and would lose the election badly. Dean played a very important role. I don't think the Democrats would be even in this race right now if not for Dean. I'm happy to explain that. But I watched the voters in Iowa do something very remarkable. I thought and very European, voting very tactically, around a big goal, but voting very tactically. Now I've seen it in Europe. I watch it in Britain where I poll. I know if you got a constituency that the Lib Dems and Labour voters both hate the Conservatives, and so they figure out who has the best chance of winning, and that's who they vote for. They squeeze out the other candidate. Very tactical, but I'm not used to. I thought American voters voted for the person they were for, and that's not what happened here. They auditioned these candidates, and I'm in awe of what they did in Iowa, and they did a turn in a pretty short period of time, deciding who was going to mount the most effective challenge, and that was impressive.
Good. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is PJ, and I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. In the last weeks of the 2000 campaign, when Gore started sounding his themes of the people versus the powerful, a lot of Republicans said that this populism was class warfare. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts about what the justification was for going stronger on those themes, and how you would define populism today, and what that role plays in the Democratic Party in the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, you highlight an issue that I was at the center of then, and I was at the center of when we were together in the White House. Let me talk. I don't. First of all, about just on the Gore campaign as a start. I came into the Gore campaign right before the Democratic convention. People versus the powerful was a slogan that they were using when I came on, so it was already there as a theme. I argued for, and I still then, and it's actually important to the argument I make in the book, which is why I'll spend a little time on it. I argued then that it was that while I believed in the concept, I wanted a populist politics, that I wanted it to be a more expansive kind of politics. And this may sound like a small difference, but what I argued for was that Al Gore wanted to make sure our prosperity enriched everybody, not just a few. And so it spoke about our prosperity and what we used our prosperity for, and it was to make sure it broadly enriched the country. I viewed that as more optimistic. I got out of the convention speech every mention of people versus powerful, except one, because I was persuaded by others that if it was completely absent from the speech, that Gore would be attacked one more time as inauthentic. So I reluctantly and incorrectly left the one mention in. The boat trip after the convention had banners that had already been made that said "People versus the Powerful," and I got the banners changed to say "Prosperity for All," to try to have a more expansive form of a populist message. I failed ultimately on the form of expression because Al Gore preferred "People versus the Powerful," not just the words. He preferred a message that he was going to take on powerful interests on the behalf of the people, and I tried unsuccessfully. I said, okay, how about for every time you talk about who you're against, why don't let's talk 4 times on who you're for. To just have a ratio of being for the people as opposed to being who you're against. I couldn't get it. It was like 100% on who was against. And he said, Al Gore, when he spoke this year, about reflecting back on 2000, that's what he believed in. He says that's who he was. And I believe that's true. I think it was part of his escaping the kind of politics that I think he viewed as a straitjacket for most of his modern political life, and I think wanted to escape that, and I think that's what he did. Now, that said, and this is very important to the history, Al Gore gave the speech, the convention speech, which was centered around the idea of making sure our prosperity enriched all, that the advertising all used that theme, not people versus powerful. And you don't get to see it here because you're not in a real battleground state as you appreciate. Al Gore went from minus down 11 points in the polls to even after the convention, and then steadily upward until he was ahead by about 5 to 8 points before the debates. That theme carried him from 11-point deficit to at least a 5-point lead, even though he was under attack in that period. Now, he lost that lead. During the debates, he basically went to 5 points down, more than 5 points, sometimes 8 points down after the debates. But he did not lose the debates because he was populist. He lost debates because he tried to strangle the other candidate. And it's important for the history because a populist message put him in the lead in the race. Lost for lots of reasons, but not because of class warfare. Class warfare, and I would have preferred a different form of it, but whatever the form of it was successful in putting his campaign in a position to win.
Yes, sir.
Hi there, my name's Jordan Solomon. I'm a student here also, and I'd like to ask you about the role of polling in selecting a vice presidential candidate for John Kerry. And I'm especially curious about, is it a national polling issue, or is it really a state or perhaps regional polling issue in choosing the vice presidential candidate this year?
First of all, in terms of the history, it's very uneven. I've actually no one's written a history of what I did during the vice presidential process, and I'm not going to reveal it now, in '92. But it's not I don't know any campaign. I was involved with Gore, and I was involved with Clinton, but I don't know of any of these processes where polling is a major factor. There may be some small piece of it, but you have a strategy for this, and there's different strategies. And Clinton's strategy, the classic, not classic, the change in strategy that Clinton employed, which was self-conscious, given that he had come out of the campaign with a majority of the country thinking he didn't have the character to be president, thinking he was liberal because of the primary process and the positions he took, that he went for a reinforcing choice. Al Gore was not there to give him southern states, but it defined him as new, as modern, as New Democrats, southern, mainstream, family, people with families and kids, and It was a completely, everything about them, at least visually, was a reinforcing choice. It was not a balancing choice in terms of some other state. And it was, the biggest jump up, in June. After, people forget, we were in third place, after the convention, after the primaries. That's one of the things that surprised me this election cycle. We've had a very partisan primary this year, and with very intense attacks on President Bush. But not only are the Democrats united, they came out, the party's image went up, and Kerry's image went up during all of that. Opposite happened in '92. Clinton, through the primaries, being attacked by Jerry Brown, whatever, Clinton went down. Anyway, it was the choice was to reinforce his image, the positive parts of his image. The other possibilities are balancing choices. See whether you bring in states. I'm not so wedded to the. Obviously, Bush chose Cheney, to give not to get Wyoming, but to not to reinforce image, but to give reassurance, that there would be sage-like advice and seasoned people around a very an inexperienced, president. And I'm not sure, I'm not sure what I'd advise Kerry. My first instinct is Edwards, because of the primary and because it was so mutually reinforcing and positive and unity of message, given Southern, and given the how non-Southern Kerry is, I think Edwards was a very good choice. But I can see a competing logic for Gephardt. Who is not just from a state like Missouri. I think that's less important than the fact that the whole job loss issue, lack of jobs, jobs outsourcing, all that makes him a very potentially strong proponent on those issues, which could make Ohio the Florida of the 2004 election. Let me just say one thing about go back to Edwards as one of the reasons why I like Edwards. When I say that I would like the Democrats to break out of this, is I think the Democrats need to tell a story about America and these times, and such as the person from 23,000 to 26,000, to tell a story about America in order to change the agenda. I think Edwards has that capacity. Yeah. That's one of the reasons why I'm.
Yeah, it's interesting how you emphasize the importance of narrative.
Yeah.
A narrative that explains and puts things into a context. It's not just an issue here, an issue there, but rather is a question of having a uniting narrative for the party that explains why we are where we are and where we're trying to go. That's what helps to bring unity and give purpose.
Right. Successful presidential campaigns, have not just a group, the right coalition or a big enough coalition, but have I'm almost never one who thinks that the get out the vote is successful because you've got the best organizers and the best, on the ground activity. If it doesn't have on top of it a rationale for why this election matters, then it's not going to work.
Yes, sir.
My name is Ned Tebbets, and I'm a graduate of the Kennedy School. I'm also a fellow of the Society of Actuaries and have worked closely with a number of members of Congress on the United States Social Security Program. And my question has to do with the fact that the Social Security program, for people in this room who are under the age of 50, the program is totally inadequately financed. And the various suggestions that the Bush administration has been making to use a portion of the payroll tax whereby people could invest in their own would work very much to the advantage of well-off people and very much to the disadvantage of people who are not well-off. So I foresee the people in the lower 60% that you've been talking about of the total income families in the United States being seriously hurt by a future Social Security program which would have significantly lower purchasing power for retirees. Could you comment why these families, but the 60% you mentioned, a majority of them are white people, they would be seriously hurt by the kind of things I'm talking about?
Okay, I thought you were going to say that you knew an actuary in the Medicare program who wanted to send emails. No, but no, you went a different way than I thought that you might have. Let me just do an anecdotal response and then a serious response. And a lot will depend on how the press handles the issue, and I don't trust the press because the elite press thinks Social Security is a giveaway to older Americans who they don't respect, who think are just want handouts. And the press, I think, is very, very skeptical about entitlement programs, and it's very hard to get serious coverage of the issue. And you're not going to get the actuary information presented in 30-second advertising. It's going to have to be the press taking apart, what is actually being proposed. Now, it was one of the great frustrations of Al Gore that George Bush had proposed moving to private savings accounts, individual accounts in Social Security, and that the trillion-dollar hole in funding he was going to fill with a commission that was going to look at the issue, and the press accepted that as we could leave the issue there. The belief was if Al Gore made a proposal and was short $1 trillion of funding, the press never would have allowed that. And it's immense frustration. And we did a lot of research trying to figure out how to explain this issue to people. Now, to me, it's illustrative of how difficult it is, but also illustrative of some things about the Republican campaign and Rove just as a tactician. We finally developed a way of addressing it, and it was with the following statement in question. George Bush has promised younger Americans their own individual savings accounts and current retirees, and promised them that their Social Security payments would not be lowered, which means they promised the same $1 trillion to both groups. He's promised the same $1 trillion to the young people for their accounts and to older people not to lower their Social Security. Which promise is he going to break? Now, we ran an ad. We finally figured it out. We ran an ad heavily about 2 weeks before the election. It was a very effective ad, very important in Florida. Bush never responded to the ad. It went unanswered, and it was very important on why. And Al Gore did win seniors by about 5 or 6 points because they got it. Okay, and young people also, were offended by it. They didn't shift their vote, but you could make the argument broadly. But it is very hard to get to that complex an issue in this kind of setting unless the press will take it seriously. Now, I'm hoping because George Bush is the incumbent that he cannot make a proposal on privatization of Social Security without the press examining the question of how you pay for it. I hope they raise the issue. I think the country right now, because of what happened on Medicare, because of the deficits, and people believe, the thing people believe the most about the deficits, particularly anybody over 50, is that jeopardizes Social Security, is that the president does not have a lot of credibility on the question, and I think there'll be a lot of caution about accepting that kind of transformation of Social Security.
Great. We're going to try to get to these 4 questions that are standing. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Scott Goldman. I'm a senior at the college writing my thesis about this, so thank you.
Okay.
I wanted to ask, where do you think these worldviews came from, and why? Is it a recent thing that tacticians have picked up on them and they're just preying on them, or have the tactics themselves helped build them up, make them more important?
Good question. Because I think it's both. This is a Clinton-esque answer. That is You've had, with the changes around civil rights, beginning in '68, the changes that took place in the '80s with Reagan. With Reagan, up until '84, there was very few Republicans who had tried to make religion very central in our politics. Reagan was the first. Nixon never did. It was Reagan who was the first to make religion a central part of our politics. It was part of a strategy. It was tactic. I'm sure it was conviction on his part, but it was very much part of a strategy for bringing the South into the Republican camp. You have in 1988, with Bush at risk of losing, moving to probably the election with probably the worst case of cultural war, with Bush the elder, with Rove part of that campaign, doing death penalty and welfare cheats and prayer in the classroom and flag burning and all of those issues to try to get, and successfully, to destroy Michael Dukakis and to enable Bush to win. And so, in each case, I mean, you have people using these issues, and each of these things has consequences. I mean, each of these elections where these issues become central move blocks of voters, around until you get more cultural uniformity. The 90s was a very polarized politics. Clinton became a lightning rod for the Republicans from 92 on, and using him for their cultural politics. And we had Gingrich and others, but the political entrepreneurs are big players, in this happening. Now, it's happening at the same time that the country's changing. I mean, as I think Scalia said on this issue of privacy and gay rights, that basically saying, we're losing the culture war. I mean, there are changes taking place, and which I think is right. And part of this is a reaction against these changes that are taking place in society. That there's a transformation taking place, that there's a strong reaction against it, that goes way beyond what any set of politicians is doing. But those become available to those tacticians to use and reinforce the trends.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
My name is Mark Solomon. I'm an independent consultant. I have a narrative question for Stanley. The story basically ends at the beginning of November, and the country's #1 reality TV series is Kerry versus Bush. And my question for Stanley
Are you
is,
auditioning for this one?
given the amount of polarity and partisanship and money being poured in to this 8-month battle between the two candidates, where do you see the major points for campaign fatigue? And given the campaign fatigue on the electorate, who is likeliest to tune out? How would you counsel either candidate on how to steer themselves above the noise and to not disaffect people based on the next 8 months?
Okay, it's just you and I talking. You raise it's 8 months before the election. From my own experience, the intensity of involvement right now on the advertising that's on the air presidentially, the intensity is high now as it is in October of a normal election. You have the president's advertising on in 17 states. You have advertising almost equal in amount from Kerry and from the outside groups in those 17 states. It's invisible to you. You don't matter because of our electoral college system. Massachusetts voters are completely disenfranchised, and you don't get to see the campaign that the rest of us. So you don't get to get fatigued. You can be excited all the way to November. Now, what I can tell you about again, things that have surprised me include that the fact that the Democratic primary, rather than producing divisions, produced unity. It produced a more favorable, even though it was intensely anti-Bush, it produced positive images for Kerry and the Democratic Party. The other part that surprises me is how closely people are following the election and events. I do a joint poll with Bill McIntyre, Republican pollster, for National Public Radio, and we did an open-ended question about the money for Iraq. This was some months ago. 50% knew the 87 million. 50% gave us the number, 87 million. Right now, people are intensely follow this election. I do polling each week, in which I ask whether people saw the ads. I ask what was in the ads. The recall of the ad content is very remarkable, including taglines. I mean, it's remarkable. People are paying very close attention. Now, it's my belief they can't keep paying this close attention for 8 months. And I don't know what the point of fatigue is. I'm assuming there's a 2 or 3 month period. I have argued aggressively that this was the period, post-Super Tuesday, is the period that Democrats had to engage because this was the period that the Republicans were going to try to destroy Kerry and make Kerry unelectable. And they have hundreds of millions of dollars in this effort. And Republicans are spending somewhere between $7 and $10 million a week.
Right now.
Right now. 7 to 10 million a week.
And how much are the Democrats spending? Democratic allies plus
altogether, probably 4 or 5 million. And so you have this battle going on. I'm assuming there's about a 2 or 3 month period, but I have to assume that the voters will, glaze over. But they've surprised me, throughout this process. I don't know if that's true. And so I think I think the summer you'll see somewhat of a lull. You'll get, you'll then have the conventions. You'll have Olympics. You'll have things that'll. But I don't think people are going to be. I think they're going to come back with passion. I think the issues that have created this election aren't going away. This history is led us to this point, and they're not going away. I think the voters will go out. I think we'll pull back. And I think the politicians will follow them out because they won't want to spend money that's not being effectively spent. But they, I think because the Republican convention is so late, basically, Labor Day, so you have a kind of a late start to the fall campaign, and I think they'll be intensively involved then.
Yes.
I'm Ganesh Sitaraman. I'm a senior here. If you were to come here a year or a year and a half ago, people in the forum would have been talking about how the Democratic Party is dead, how it has no soul, and it's fundamentally flawed. Right now, we're in a big campaign. People don't particularly care about the party on kind of a broad scale. They're just worried about Kerry. I'm wondering, aside from reading your book, what should we do to fix the Democratic Party so people are talking about inequality, so people are talking about Social Security, or whatever the other kind of broad issues are, so that the party kind of dominates for the next 20 to 30 years?
Mm-hmm.
Do we need to get rid of the DNC? Do we need to get rid of all the candidates and everyone in the Senate? What needs to happen?
I love your question. But read my book I did spend a lot of time figuring this out. Let me go back to the year and a half ago point. What happened. As part of this process, Democrats obviously have grown passionate as Republicans have grown passionate. As we've seen, and there's actually some recent polling on this, Democrats believed that George Bush was illegitimately elected in 2000, and he was. But more than that, it's that he chose after that moment not to throw aside party platforms and say, okay, we had a very special election, divided country. I'm going to have Republicans, Democrats in my cabinet. We're going to find a way to unite the country. I think the country would have rallied to him had he recognized that moment and reached out, which he didn't. Governed in very partisan terms right from the outset, with a very conservative agenda, trying to force it through. He faced a similar moment post 9/11. When I think, again, the country, wanted to rally beyond the military rally. I think it was a sense of community. I think he could have said, let's throw out our budgets, throw out my taxes, throw out your program, let's come together. We're going to address both our domestic problems, our international problems together. Country would have rallied. He didn't. Governed with a very partisan foreign policy, which did not bring either over other countries or other segments of the electorate. Right now, if you ask whether Iraq is worth it, countries half say it's not worth it and half say it was worth it. It's just he's accepted that division, has governed within it, has not tried to grow beyond it. I think Democrats are angry him for the way he governed and for and for how he was elected. Now they are also angry. Democrats, the Democratic populists, were angry at the Democratic political class who, faced with that moment and that kind of presidency, did not challenge it. That they didn't challenge it in his budget, they didn't challenge his tax proposals, they didn't challenge his foreign policy, they didn't challenge it. And a year and a half ago, that's the anger we would have reflected. That's why Dean took off and was so successful. And the other candidates, only when the other candidates got it, that they had to both be oppositional and strong opponents to the Bush direction, did the electorate move toward them. And the people created Dean. And the people created the dynamic that we have right now that enables us both to potentially win, but also hopefully potentially do something much bigger. So the question is, what do we use the moment for? What my hope is, we don't use it for tactics. That is and I'm not optimistic on this, because I think when the election's this closely fought, to say, okay, let's, we've got all these passions up to get all this unity. You suddenly say, all right, well, let's not talk about the issues that brought all that passion. Let's talk about something else. Well, there's a risk in that, and it's real. You don't talk about base issues. Rove believes on his side, if we're not talking about, we're not talking about abortion and late-term abortions and gays, and we're going to talk about something else, those voters are going to wander off. That their turnout's going to be down, they're not going to be united, and so if you pull away. So I am not optimistic. I think if we fall down in the polls, I don't want to recommend this, I think we're much more likely to go bold if we were to fall further back in the polls. Being ahead or even it makes it very difficult to risk doing something bigger. What I've done in the book is try to give the tools, because what I've done in the book is I've written the narrative, what I think the bigger narrative, not just a set of policies. I've offered the policies too, but I've also created a bigger narrative. But I've also pulled it. I mean, at the end of the thing, I put a Reagan a renewed kind of Reaganism that Bush represents, against what I call the JFK, Democrats, opportunity Democrats, and we dominate and cuts across. It's a different line. It cuts all across the electorate. The country's hungry for it. We obviously need all the people in this room and all your friends and many, 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 many more to say we want more than tactics.
Well, 2 more questions. We're going to ask you to both be brief. Let's have both questions together, and then we'll...
I promise to be brief, too.
Okay.
Sure. My name is Fouad Mardouki, and Dr. Greenberg, I was wondering if you think Senator Kerry's qualified support for the war, or at least the support for the idea of a war, will hurt him with his Democratic base, or conversely, could it help him with independents and moderate Republicans? And the sum total, do you think that'll be in his favor, or will it end up hurting him in this year's election?
Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Peter Braun. I'm a physician, a healthcare consultant, and a faculty member at the Harvard School of Public Health. And my question has to do with the environment, and it is, how does our environmental future cut across these cultural blocks that you've described?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let me deal with the environmental piece first. The environment is. If you look at electorally, there's no doubt that the voters that are most concerned with the environment, are part of the cultural modernist, bloc. It's most intense with the best educated and the cosmopolitan regions of the country, and it's too bad. It makes it hard. Makes it hard to have it as a breakout issue. I spend a lot of my time working for the NRDC for the Climate Center and work on global warming, and I spent a lot of time to figure out how to make global warming, a more urgent phenomenon across the, electorate. And it's hard tactically when you have, states and you have interests, that, particularly related to the auto industry and coal that, that are very reluctant, to take serious steps. But it's also reinforcing. Of the divide. Now it may be, if you look at most of the demographic trends, they favor those groupings, those areas of the country, that are concerned with these issues. But, we can wait, hell can freeze over by the time these demographic changes, are big enough, for these groups to have an impact. What's interesting on the environment is that the Bush first dropped in popularity not because of the recession. This is in 2001. He dropped over his energy policy. Okay, now I've tried to figure. I was polling and trying to figure that out during that period, and it came when Cheney said the conservation was not important. Now, what people concluded in that period, it was that somehow, because of their either worldview or their association with the energy industry, that on something as important as energy security, which is what they said they were doing, that they were not acting in the interest of the nation. And people pulled back in big numbers. This is not a theoretical thing. I watched those votes pulled away on conservation. Now, if you had polled conservation, you never would have gotten a number for concept having political consequences in concert. There was something big contained in the wrong choice they made on something important to the country. Now, when things are going badly for for somebody, when trust is dropping, which is happening with Bush, sometimes things that were not effective issues before suddenly become more relevant because trust levels have dropped. I think it's possible that issues of the environment, I don't know about at the level of global environment, become important as people say, what does that say about the choices that they make when choosing between the interest groups that they support and the national public interest? And so I watched that drop in 2001. I'm still pressing for environmental issues to be a strong part of the 2004 election because it's part of the narrative. It's part of the choices that they make. Remind me, on the previous question was?
Kerry in the war.
Oh, in the war. What's interesting on the the voters are not just tactical in their choice of candidates. We did a survey in December of last year of Democratic primary voters. And we asked the question, are you for or against the war? Okay. 2-to-1 against the war. Maybe 3-to-1, against the war. Then we asked the question, do you want a candidate who was against the war from the beginning? Or do you want a candidate who had reservations about the war and supported it? It was basically Kerry's position. And a large majority chose the candidate that voted for with reservations. Despite the fact that 3-to-1 they were against the war. Now, not only were they making a tactical choice of candidates and who they can win, they were making a tactical decision that they wanted a candidate that they thought could go to the country, on the war. Now, it's a level of sophistication and bank shots that I would have said is not possible, but I believe it is possible. I watched this happen. They clearly walked away from the candidate who aligned with their position on the war in favor of a more complex position. So I think it's not just independents. I think Democratic primary voters wanted someone they thought could get on the stage, with George Bush. Now, whether Kerry does that deftly is a different question. I mean, obviously, last week's performance was not helpful, and so he has to offer that position with conviction. But I think that actually the country is conflicted. They are divided on the war, but overwhelmingly they're glad that Saddam Hussein is gone. And people would not, for the most part, want to revisit the war decision. And so people themselves have complex positions. So I think as long as they believe Kerry is speaking with conviction about what he said the choices he made, I think he's fine, both base and independence, with the complexity that's in his actual behavior.
Stan, let me ask you one more question, if I might, because you do so much survey work overseas. Is the rift that's now taking place between the United States and many of our friends overseas, is that driven almost exclusively by policies with regard to Iraq, or is there something deeper going on? Are we coming to cultural differences between America and Europe that hold serious implications for the future?
Well, it's more complicated than that. Even with the number of choices that you gave me, it's more complicated than that. Though it's hard not to focus on Bush and the Iraq War, decision. I put Bush in all my polls everywhere in the world. So I have my own little, reading of, of this. But there's different, different dynamics. I polled in, Venezuela and now, and Bolivia, and fairly recently in Brazil. The issues there in terms of the globalization and the very disappointing benefits of that process were central to the kind of populist uprisings that have come there, independent of Bush. Bush is accentuated. He looks like he is, there doesn't seem any kind of empathetic side to George Bush in terms of how people are experiencing globalization. So he's just irrelevant to that, to that process. But he's not irrelevant to it. He's very relevant. But the fact that it doesn't seem to get it, magnifies the problem. But the problem goes way beyond George Bush. On the other hand, if you go to Eastern Europe, we're polling now in Romania and Hungary and Bulgaria, where the U.S. is much more popular than in Western Europe. and where there's much more room for joint actions with the U.S. Bush is not as unpopular. But in the rest of Western Europe, and I can't talk about Britain because it's a current client, but if you look at the rest of Western Europe, Bush is unbelievably unpopular and symbolizes an arrogant, bullying, isolated America. And I mean, think about this. 3 of our closest allies, Spain, Germany, South Korea, have governments that are in power because of their opposition to George Bush's policies. That's a remarkable change. And so it's not, I mean, this is not just theory. This is, real changes in governments based on how the public relates to George Bush and has impact on the alliances that we can build, and politicians around the world will factor in. And I'm sure the same is true in Latin America, that the governments have to factor in how the populace reacts to their allying with or helping the U.S. in various areas. And so, and the American public gets it too. Just take it back home. Right now, if you ask which party you trust on foreign policy, the Democrats are ahead. Democrats are never ahead. We weren't ahead when in the Clinton White House. Republicans just seem to do better on foreign policy. It's not, they're ahead on military questions, security questions, not foreign policy. Right now, Democrats are more trusted on foreign policy. And the public does not believe that America losing respect in the world is in our interest. And they're nervous about that isolation. And there is a basis. I am not worried about a foreign policy debate between Kerry and Bush. I think there's a strong foundation for a serious foreign policy debate which Democrats can win, and that I think Kerry is capable of taking up. But it's rooted in the foreign policy that has isolated the United States. And so this plays out in different ways, different parts of the world, but it's impactful there and it's impactful here.
Well, I think you now know why across American politics, among Republicans as well as Democrats, Stan Greenberg is respected as one of the best minds about our politics, and many are passionate followers about his own policies. He'll be at the Coop for those of you who wish to pursue the conversation, but also there'll be a book signing there. We invite you to join him there. I don't know whether Rosa DeLauro will be there or not, but we thank you again, Rosa, for coming. And most of all, Stan, we thank you for coming here to the forum and speaking to us.
Thank you. Very generous. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good.